Welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. Process? What did we decide on, Ronan?
I think we've decided after we've recorded the episode we're about to introduce that we're going to decide what we're going to decide on using. So we haven't yet decided if it's process or process.
We'll put a vote out there to all the listeners whether we want to say process or process, depending, of course, on your accent. But we'll pick one and stick with it going forward. Anyway, we have a great show for you today. We have a fascinating show for you today. Ronan and I have already conducted this interview, so we know just how good it is. Ronan, who are we talking with?
We are chatting to Mathieu Heijboer, who is head of performance at Jumbo-Visma and an absolutely fascinating individual who talks us through everything from the shit days, as he described them, of 2015, where the team won 6 races, right up to today, when obviously the team has won all 3 Grand Tours this season and has 70 odd victories to its name already this year. So yeah, absolutely fascinating conversation throughout.
Yeah, he gets into kind of luring Wout van Aert over in the early days, because if you recall, Wout came over before the team was any good. Talked about how kind of their process was a big part of what pulled him in the door and what convinced him to join the program. And you could argue that bringing in a talent like that probably was very helpful in bringing in additional talents too. So we talked about that. We talked about his involvement in rider training, in sort of the physiology side of things, as well as on the equipment side, how they picked their shoes, for example. Really fascinating chat.
Well, it kind of all comes down to his 3 pillars of performance as he sees it, which are training, equipment, and nutrition, and how his role sees him oversee all 3 of those elements that go into performance, and how he optimizes around each. But also he talks us through the process of ensuring that things like wearables, how they decide if something is actually useful or if it's just another trend, equipment, how they test equipment before they actually use it in events, how they decided on which shoes to use, how they decide on any equipment, what kind of training interventions they're making, how they're using power versus how he would have used power when he was racing, how nutrition has differed from when he was a pro with Cofidis in the mid-2000s to how the team are doing it today throughout all 3 teams that they have under the Jumbo-Visma umbrella.
Plus a whole bunch about altitude training, which I found particularly interesting. Kind of rebuffed a rumor that we had heard, I think, but also shed some light on the level of detail that they are going into to optimize altitude training for each rider.
Seemingly it's no longer a guessing game for Jumbo, but he was a little bit cautious on giving away too much of their performance advantage in certain elements of the conversation, but actually quite surprisingly open and for the vast majority of the conversation you're about to hear.
Yeah, he gave us more than I thought he would. Well, let's drop straight into our interview with Mathieu.
All right, Mathieu Heijboer, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us here today. This is one we've been trying to get together for a while. We initially spoke around the tour and around Jonas's dominant performance in the time trial, and we had an article that followed off the back of that, which was that was just incredibly fascinating. And we have you back here today just to talk all things, your role, which is head of performance at Jumbo-Visma. So I'm not even going to attempt to define what your role is. It's probably better to throw to you and just give us define the role that you have at Jumbo-Visma and what it is you're in charge of there.
Yeah, so my role is head of performance, which means I'm responsible for everything that has to do with preparing the riders for the big races, for the big events. We have 3 pillars under performance, which is training, which is nutrition, and which is equipment. So those are all my responsibility to make sure riders start with the best training, so in the best shape, with the best nutrition, also with the best equipment to the races. Obviously, I'm not doing it alone. I have a great bunch of people around me. with performance coaches, with nutritionists, with an engineer. So all kinds of expertise are in our performance team, and we're really working together closely to make sure the riders are at their best at the right moment.
And is that just for the men's team, or is that the men's and women's team, and across even other sports? Or
so my responsibility is for all three teams, but in practice, I'm working mostly with a World Tour team. I'm also coaching some of the riders in the World Tour team, but to make sure we all work according to the same philosophy, I have always I'm in contact with the development team as well and with the women's team as well, to make sure we all work according to the same Jumbo-Visma philosophy.
Well, I think, it goes without saying, it's been pretty successful, that philosophy, over the past couple of years. Can you give us a bit of an insight into, first of all, how that philosophy has come about, what that philosophy is? Has that evolved down through the years? Because I think it's fair to say, when Rabobank folded over a decade ago, the success wasn't there for a few years through Blanco and Belkin. But recently, with Jumbo's involvement, it seems to be year on year improving. So I guess the question is, what is that philosophy?
So I mean, that philosophy has developed over the years, and I think it's very important to start back in 2015, when the first year of Lotto Jumbo started, and when we were a very small team with almost no victories, with very shitty performances, but also a very bad atmosphere and working atmosphere in the whole team. So there were no victories, no performance, no budget. A lot of things weren't good at that time. And then we started first talking about our culture, how are we working together? And it was not only about a training or performance, but it was really about just the people in the team, riders and staff. How were they working together? And from that moment, we started to define our culture, our core values. And also in that development, we started creating a vision on training. How do we want to train? We started thinking about nutrition. We started thinking about equipment. So we all made small steps. Luckily we had some great new riders in the team starting from 2016. And we already were then creating it, or at least trying to create an environment where riders could reach their full potential, although resources were very limited at that time. But then, the team started growing with the success, for example, with Primoz and with Dylan. Then the sponsors, they started growing as well because they wanted to keep the team together. Then we get a little bit more funding, a little bit more opportunities to hire a little bit more people around the riders again. So that philosophy on training, but in fact the philosophy on the whole team about how do we want to act together, how do we want to work together, how do we train, that all went better and better every year. And if you ask me now, look, what's your philosophy? I think the main fundament below our philosophy is that we're trying to do everything together. So we bring a lot of people together, we listen to everyone, and we're trying to make the right program, the right nutrition program, the right equipment together to make it work. So there's not a lot of, let's say, bureaucracy in our team, but really working along the lines with everyone who was giving his input, and even the riders, obviously, to make sure we make plans that are supported by everyone, and then we start working on that plan and try to follow that plan without making a lot of compromises.
I think thinking back to that time, you mentioned 2015, shortly after that, Wout van Aert signed for the team, and at that time, it sort of struck me as a bit of a surprise because the success wasn't with Jumbo-Visma or Lotto Jumbo as it may have been then, and he obviously had the option to go anywhere he liked. Is there? You mentioned budget also. How do you overcome the chicken and egg situation where clearly you've inspired Van Aert to join the squad before the success is there, where easily he could have turned around and said, well, come back to me when you are successful and then I'll consider it.
Yeah. So we we made it very clear how we were looking at cycling, how we were looking at performance, and how we were looking at training. And although it's true that it was still a little bit limited in resource and what we could do, at least we could show him that everything we did was built around performance-driven choices. So everything we did, we tried to do it as good as possible, but always with a performance driven approach. It also made it a little bit easier that his coach back at the time was already a Lotto Jumbo coach at that time, Mark Lambert. So he was working with him already since he was very young. So Mark could already show him the way the team was working, and he couldn't lie about it, obviously, because they were so close. So Wout, he already knew that although we were not maybe the biggest team in the world back then, he knew everything he wanted, and what he was missing at that time was available in our team. And that was really tempting for him, and that's why he decided to sign with us.
Was there like an organization, be that within cycling or within a different sport, or maybe not even in sport, but some other organization that inspired Jumbo's new approach or Jumbo's new structure that ultimately has led to this success?
Well, the way of building a team and building a strong organization where everybody is feeling responsible for the growth of the team, that was really inspired by the book Legacy about the All Blacks. So that's a big inspiration for especially Richard Plugge and Marijn Zeeman, who were really the founders of the new team. And then what I, for example, did, I had a lot of talks with Jack Ory, who was the speed skating coach of the Lotto Jumbo speed skating team, because we were one team speed skating department, which is very popular in the Netherlands and cycling. Well, he also gave me a lot of insights in how he built up his speed skating team. He was already very successful back then already with a lot of Olympic gold medals, and he still is. Those were some of the examples that I just went to other successful coaches to listen to, and to how to build like a performance-driven structure around the athlete to make sure they reach the full potential.
You've chosen a bad week to mention the All Blacks there, being an Irishman, having been knocked out of the World Cup by the All Blacks. But actually, maybe that's also where I've gone wrong, is I've only got about halfway through that book, so I need to come back to it all of these years later and finish it maybe. I think you mentioned there your 3 pillars: training, nutrition, and equipment. And fast forward to today, I think it'd be interesting to jump into each of those. Probably starting with training is probably the best place to start. You mentioned you're head of performance. You have a coaching team below you, but you're also coaching some of the riders on a daily basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but in fact, the way we see it is we have like a Jumbo-Visma performance team helping the riders to reach their full potential. So one of my roles is to write some of the riders' personal training programs, but I cannot do that without the input of our nutritionist, without the input of our embedded scientist, or our data analyst. So, in conservative or conventional cycling, it's like coaches are really seen as like a private coach who is driving a rider to their best, but we really see it like riders are coached here by a Jumbo-Visma performance coach, which obviously they are connected. So we have 4 performance coaches now, although unfortunately one of them left shortly a while ago. But they are coaching 5 to 8 riders, and we try to match the character. But in the end, we're all working along the same philosophy. So that means whenever someone is leaving the team, we try to find another performance coach, and we onboard him on our philosophy. And that means every rider knows exactly how we train and how they should be trained. And obviously there's always room for individual customization because there are different types of riders, obviously. But in general, the way of working, it's the Jumbo-Visma way of working. And I think that separates us from a lot of other teams.
I think that is very different in that we hear a lot of other teams, or a lot of other riders at other teams, have individual and private coaches that they work with.
Yeah.
And there's maybe pros and cons to both approach, but like the Jumbo-Visma approach there, it sounds like you've got, if I'm hearing you correctly, a coach in the traditional sense of the term. You've also got maybe a nutritionist, maybe an aerodynamicist, maybe a bike fitter, maybe a doctor, maybe, I don't know all the different roles, but they're all feeding into the coach who then sets a program based on all that information rather than based on what he or she has done in the past that worked for other athletes. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's true. So we have a lot of communication together. We have a lot of meetings together to update everyone about the status of riders. So I also, although Jonas is not, for example, a rider I directly coach, I'm 100% aware of what he's doing, why he's doing it. And I'm also giving Tim Heemskerk, who's my colleague, a lot of input on his program, while he is also giving me a lot of input on the program I ride, for example, for Sepp Kuss. So, there's definitely not private coaches, but it's really about Jumbo-Visma coaching the riders.
Are power meters the gold standard in terms of your training there, or is there still a lot of room for and I guess that goes beyond power meters, but just in terms of training load, training stimulus, training prescription, is it watts, or is there more to it than that?
No, there's more to it. So obviously there's a lot of parameters to be measured and to be monitored every day, but we never try to lose out of sight that it's about the basics, and the basics is about just having a good contact with your rider, listen very carefully to what he's saying. Is a training perceived as hard or maybe not really hard? Did you want to have to train him hard, or did you want to training to be easy? So it starts always with a very good just human relationship and human contact. And I think that's the solid basis under the coach-rider connection. And obviously, besides to that, there's a lot of parameters to be measured, watts, pulse in the morning, maybe HRV, etc. But we define our choices or our decisions mostly just on the direct contact or the direct relationship with the rider.
Brief interlude here. Can we define HRV, please? Just acronym soup.
Yes, HRV stands for heart rate variability, which is the variation in time intervals between successive heartbeats. It's not the same as heart rate, which simply measures the number of heartbeats per minute. HRV, on the other hand, examines the fluctuations in time between each heartbeat, which can provide insights into autonomic nervous system's activity, and some use it to prescribe training and assess how recovered or not recovered an athlete may be, and if they're ready to train or not.
Yeah, it's like the basis of the Whoop score thing. Anyway, that's just what HRV is. We're going to try on this podcast. When there is an acronym that we think maybe a lot of our audience is not familiar with, we'll just stop like this and tell you what it is. Let's get back to the chat. You mentioned data analysts before as one of the members of the team. I'm interested to hear what that individual is analyzing. Like, what is it? Are they analyzing power data? Are they analyzing what are they taking a look at, and what are you getting out of it?
Yeah, it's a pretty new role in the team. But what he's doing mostly is making race analysis. Looking at the power output at some points in the race. Obviously, back in 2015, 2016, winning a Grand Tour was far out of reach. So we had to more or less a little bit calculate, okay, what is needed to win a Grand Tour. Now we have the benchmarks in our team, so which is very useful because we can use that benchmark already to develop the young guys from the development team, to show them, look, if you want to win the Tour de France in the future, you have to be able to do this, this, and this. And our data analyst is really, going down in all those numbers and also teaching us, and I mean us, the other members of the performance team, to what is needed to win the big races, and why we maybe weren't succeeding at some races and why we were. So that is one part of his job. And obviously another part is also the scouting process. So looking for new riders to strengthen our team, looking at power profiles, looking at race results, etc.
Was that born out of, like, if I just look around my room here now, I've got core temperature sensors, hydration, sweat monitors. I've got sleep trackers, 2 different sleep trackers, heart rate monitor, HRV. There's a wearable for everything these days. We almost need a wearable to keep track of all the different wearables that we have. Is that part of the data analyst's role? Is that maybe where it evolved from, and making sense of that?
Incidentally, yes. So if we think there's something to gain, we could do that with a rider. We're not doing it like for the complete team with everyone. But the big danger with all those wearables and all those data that's coming in is that you lose the human contact. And we still think do the basics right and focus on the basics again. That's most important here. So it can help us a lot, all those wearables and all those information sources. Yeah, like I just mentioned, we always try to keep each other on the right track, and the right track is doing the basics right, and use those wearables only as an helping thing, but not use that as our direction to go to.
Is there a way, I mean, like, as each of these wearables come out, they seem to like pique interest immediately. They're sort of mentioned in scientific papers, or they're advertised somewhere, and then they pique an athlete's interest or pique a coach's interest, and everybody seems to dive on them, and then they slowly sort of die away, and they maybe level out. Where ultimately we sort of realize where, yes, it is another metric, it's another data input, it's another way to measure a rider's performance or a rider's recovery. But is there any way that, I think, like, continuous lactate and continuous glucose monitoring, both of those have been like, glucose has been around for the past couple of years and has gained a lot of attention, and lactate seems to be coming more and more into people's focus at the moment. Is there a way that you kind of fast forward to the point where you realize how valuable the information is and how much is just noise? Or how do you evaluate new tech like that as it emerges and decide this is useful or this is not useful?
Yeah. Well, obviously all those new devices or metrics, etc., they are we are interested in them and try to study it if it can be useful. But what I found out in the past few years is, while using them, it often learns you a lot, or you learn a lot from it, and you get to know your body maybe a little bit better, or the way how you react on training or whatever. But then at some point you don't need to use it anymore, because you've learned the trick, and then you can do it by intuition or by feel. And I think in that sense it is really useful. But it's the same, in fact, with a power meter. If you're working really closely and thoroughly with a power meter, at some point you can really feel what power you're pushing, and even then you don't really need it anymore. Obviously, for us, it's really interesting to do post-training analysis or post-race analysis. But for the athlete, it's mostly a very helpful device to get to know themselves better. But at some point, they don't really need it anymore.
Sorry, Kate, you're gonna.
No, that's just interesting. I would tend to agree with it. Like, I feel like I could probably tell you how many watts I'm pushing at any given point in time from riding with one for 10 years, right? So it makes a lot of sense.
Probably depends on which parameter you're using, but that's an entirely different conversation.
I already told you, Ronan, I like the ones that read high. Those are my preferred parameters.
Sometimes guessing is maybe best. I want to ask you a bit about altitude training, because it's something that teams have started using more and more over the past decade. And from my having never done altitude training myself, I don't know all that much about it. But from my limited understanding of it, there's an initial response when a rider goes to altitude. They get a decrease in plasma volume, which then increases hematocrit and hemoglobin concentrations. And those concentrations have been what we've looked at for years in terms of determining how valuable altitude training has been, but actually the hematocrit and hemoglobin concentration isn't actually having any effect on performance level. But what is actually important is hemoglobin mass.
Yeah.
And measuring that has always been like almost impossible from what I understand. But you or Jumbo-Visma have now developed ways of being much more prescriptive and much more accurate with altitude training by finding ways to measure hemoglobin mass accurately and easily and repeatably. Is that right? Or there seems to be a lot of value in the type of altitude training that Jumbo-Visma have done recently.
Yeah, but that's mainly based on experience by doing it every year, 3-4 times a year, 3 weeks on altitude, and learning, evaluating every training camp we do. I think obviously there's a lot of advantage in going on altitude for the physiological way on the physiological side, but there's also just let's say the training camp effect. So being separated from every distraction on a mountain, having the right nutrition, having people around you that take care of your laundry, etc. So the trainability at altitude or on a training camp is so much higher than when you're at home. That I think that's one of the key success factors of a training camp, not necessarily an altitude camp. But then being an altitude, it gives you that little extra. And yeah, since a few years we're working with Professor Bent Ronnestad, who is doing also hemoglobin measurements with us. But that learns us only a little bit more about how riders are reacting on altitude. And yeah, from that learning experience, we try to optimize training programs, obviously. But in fact, these are very small steps. So every year we try to do it a little bit better.
So I have a Sepp Kuss question. This just occurred to me. I've always wondered this because we always talk about like altitude natives, like the Colombian guys, for example, how they react a bit differently to altitude. Does Sepp do the same thing? Because he grew up at 2,000 meters. Does he react differently from from like the European guys?
Not really. But he's much more at ease at altitude. So that's a big difference when you look at just objective parameters that we measured the last few years. I don't see big differences. But just when talking to him and following him and seeing a lot of riders suffering or a little bit in difficult the first few days, then Sepp is just at home, So that's a big difference, yeah.
You mentioned Bent Ronnestad there, who's I could probably waste a month, or not waste, I could probably very wisely spend a month researching and reading all his research papers and studies and that. One place I've seen his name pop up previously was with the Ditalo blood volume analyzer. And I was wondering, is that something you use to like get very, very specific in how much altitude and what altitude a rider works best at and responds best to, and is 2 weeks enough, or is 4 weeks required, and is 2,000 meters enough, or there's even rumors doing the rounds this year that the team are bringing altitude tents to altitude camps to sleep even higher. Is any of that actually valuable?
Crossed our minds, obviously, because for some riders you do see a lot of response, and with other riders you do not see a lot of response. So then you start thinking, okay, how can we maybe change the environment a little bit to see if we can create a little bit more response than we actually measure now. But honestly, we never use the altitude tent at altitude. But it did cross our minds, yes.
And the analyzer and things, like, is that something you've used?
No.
Okay.
So when you talk about response, you're just talking about, are you talking about blood values or power values, or?
Then I'm just talking about hemoglobin mass as a response. But obviously that's just one of the responses to altitude, where there's a lot of other responses that are also important. But just specifically talking about this one, some riders have a big increase, others don't. And it's a nice puzzle to solve.
Any listeners to this podcast or readers of escapecollective.com will know how much I talk about heat training. And I've seen suggestions this year that actually heat training may be a way to prolong the benefits of altitude training. Mm-hmm. Is that something you are using? Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, so probably you read the papers as well from Bent, where he's showing that altitude or heat training can be a replacement of altitude training, but not on the same level. But still, it has more or less the same effects, but not as strong. But what we sometimes do is after altitude camp, continue or start doing some heat training sessions to maintain the effects that we have achieved from those 3 weeks on altitude. So that's a strategy to lengthen the effect of altitude training.
I guess one other question I just had was how important metabolic profiling is to the team, rather than, a lot of listeners, myself included, will, turn to 20-minute tests or critical power for setting our training zones and that. But I think one of the first times Jumbo-Visma's sort of more detailed approach came to my awareness was as far back as like 2018 or 2019. I heard of the team working with Inside and using metabolic profiling to set training zones and training targets. And maybe give us a breakdown on how you use metabolic profiling to benefit the riders.
Another quick stop here in the middle of our conversation. Ronan, can you define metabolic profiling for me?
I can define it to the best of my understanding, which is basically that teams are no longer using 20-minute FTP tests or any number of different power tests that are available out there, and instead they're looking toward, some teams at least are incorporating what they refer to as metabolic profiling. And this is a sort of, I've heard it described as a look under the hood of the different contributions from a physiology point of view that go into performances, and that could include like aerobic capacity, glycolytic capacity, anaerobic threshold, different fuel contributions, like how much fat is a rider using versus how much carbohydrate they're using to produce a given power output. Also looks into the likes of lactate accumulation and combustion and how long.
Combustion. We're catching on fire now.
And also just, I think it's, broadly speaking, I look at the sort of aerobic versus anaerobic energy contributions that go into the power you're producing at the pedals, because there's sort of this sort of long held opinion, not really an opinion, but a sort of an understanding that, and it comes from breaking power training into zones, and zone 1 does one thing, and zone 2 does another, and zone 3 does another, and zone 4 and so on. And actually, it's not that clear cut that if your zone 3 is 290 to 300 watts and you're at 289, so it's an entirely different zone, and 301's an entirely different zone again. It's actually more the case of there's always an overlap between the aerobic and the anaerobic energy contributions, and a metabolic profile sort of looks into what those contributions may be and how that impacts a whole host of other. Hit my brick wall there in terms of what I know, but you got the gist.
This is basically it's a much more detailed, fancy version of like the Andy Kogan like watts per kilo chart that many of our listeners might be familiar with, where you put in your, okay, this is my peak 5 second watt per kilogram, my peak 1 minute, my peak 5 minute, my peak threshold watts per kilo, and it kind of like shows you where your strengths and weaknesses are relative to others. And it sounds like essentially kind of a more detailed version of that, with obviously a lot more information in it. But the end result, the attempt is similar, which is to describe the athlete, type of athlete, and so therefore you can prescribe training.
I think one of the big things that they can, and it's probably worth explaining first of all, while there are methods that don't involve lactate testing, quite often, and from what I understand Jumbo-Visma are doing, they actually are doing lactate testing as part of this testing to determine, as I already mentioned, lactate accumulation and combustion rates. And actually what they can then do from those values and the graphs that they get in these metabolic profiles is determine, exactly what wattage you should sit at and for exactly how long to get the stimulus that they're targeting that day, rather than do 5 by 5 minutes for a VO2 effort. It's do X amount of minutes at X amount of watts with X amount of recovery. And it's a much more prescriptive and precise way to understand the best training stimulus that a rider needs and when they need it.
You know what we should do?
A full
we
podcast.
Should. Yes. We should. One, we should do a whole podcast on this. Two, we should ask Neil Henderson about this when we talk with him soon. Neil's going to join us. He's one of the world's best coaches. He's coached Rowan Dennis to world championships, and I think Neil could probably explain this better than we can.
It's something I have a lot of experience in using, but not for a long time now. And I know that there are pros and cons to it. There are fans of metabolic profiling, and there are others who say it's overkill, it's not needed. But I've certainly seen value in it before, and I would definitely want to deep dive on it.
Let's deep dive on it. But let's now get back to our chat with Mathieu.
Yeah, maybe give us a breakdown on how you use metabolic profiling to benefit the riders.
Yeah, we used to work with Insight back in the day. That's true. And we used that to do our lactate testing and to also use the metabolic profile to learn more about the riders, about their profiles, and do we have a more explosive type of rider or do we have a more endurance type of rider, and how can we alter that characteristic a little bit towards one or the other side if we wanted to be more successful in classics or more in stage races, etc. That was really, really helpful when we started testing, and also used that concept of looking at training, which is also based on the work of Jan Olbrecht, obviously. So we used those testing, that methodology to learn more about the riders, and also pinpoint the training in the direction we wanted to. It was really, really useful. That's true.
Is that something we had a listener question through our members only Discord channel? I think it was Paddy Q who had asked, is that how you manage load and race scheduling for multidisciplinary riders? Is that something, that the metabolic profiling you're talking about and leaning it one way or the other to be more successful in classics or grand tours, is that something you're also bringing in for the likes of Wout? Is that how we can see him be successful in cyclocross, in classics, and then in the high mountains and in the grand tours? Or how, I guess the question is how you're having one rider perform so well in such varying terrain and disciplines.
Yeah, so to be clear, it starts with the talent he has. and I definitely don't want to give here the impression that he's a product of us or something that we make, because he is so talented. And I always say, if you put him on the track and he will focus on the track for 1 year, he is also there very close, because he's just so talented in everything that he's doing. But we try to use the concept of metabolic profiling and the concept of the way Jan Olbrecht, for example, is looking at training and build-up and periodization to what training ingredients we give Wout, for example, in a cyclocross season, and how do we change that towards classic season, and how do we change it again towards a Grand Tour season, or towards the Tour de France the last few years. And that all has to do with changing a little bit in volume, adding more threshold training or more VO2 max training, adding more or less anaerobic efforts in training. It's every time a little bit fine-tuning about what ingredients, but the basics always stay to make sure that his VO2 max, his aerobic capacity, is very high, And that solid foundation, he is so talented, he can almost go everywhere he wants.
I think we could probably talk about Wout and his training and his talent all day, but we better move it on to equipment at some point. What, like in terms of equipment being one of your pillars of performance, what does your involvement in the team's equipment choices and selections look like, and what impact are you having there?
Yeah, so again, I'll try to make sure that all choices on performance or on equipment are performance based. And for example,
hey folks, Ronan here, just to say thank you for listening to this short taste of the performance process. If you've been enjoying this podcast and want to listen to the rest of it, you'll need to head over to escapecollective.com/join and sign up there, because Performance Process is an Escape members only podcast, which means that you need to be an Escape member to listen to the rest of it. So if you're not, I'm afraid that's all there is for today, folks. But if you do want to hear the rest of it, head on over, sign up at escapecollective.com/join. And once you've done so, you'll get an email with instructions for adding the private member feed to your podcast app of choice, be that Apple Podcast, be whatever. And it's quick and easy to do so. Thank you.